Dear podcast listeners, today we have the honor with Kamran Khan from the University of Leicester. Before we start, Kamran, where are we standing right now?
So we are outside in London near King's College.
And it's quite windy, as you can hear. So Kamran, you've written a paper. What is it about?
So I'm looking at the links between English language learning in the UK with discourses of integration and really how that links to political discourses and even legislation that links all of this to kind of security measures in the UK.
So your paper is framed within the larger context of the immigration debate.
It is. So the starting point is 2001, not actually for 9/11. It's the starting point is the 2001 riots between British Asians.
There's a train passing by.
Yeah, stopping now. Between British Asians in the UK, so they had riots against kind of far-right extremists and the police. Now, because of that, there was a citizenship debate about how immigrants, how we need a kind of unified nation, because these communities.
Was it the first time that this happened?
Riots? No, we've had plenty.
But the debate?
Now, the debate, that was what the interesting thing was. We've had an English language requirement in the 1981 British Nationality Act. So actually what few people know is actually British citizenship's only really existed since 81. So before then, we'd had other concepts such as British subjects, Commonwealth citizens, but actually a national citizenship. It was only since 1981 because they never really wanted to, they always wanted to be linked to the Commonwealth and the kind of the colonial power. And so actually it was stripping that away and actually focusing on national citizenship. So that's quite a big thing.
As a reaction towards the immigration?
1981, yeah, it was. There was never an independent British citizenship. It's purely linked to immigration control. So it's defined by who we don't want in and who we are. So that's in 81, 2001 with 9/11. All
20 years later?
Yeah, 20 years later.
Just contextualize these riots. What was it about again?
Yeah, so during that summer there were three cities in the north of England, high unemployment, segregation and things like this. Now, what the tension was at the time was that the far-right, there was kind of far-right groups at that time, and what they were basically doing was going into cities and having protests and things like this. The British Asians at the time felt like it was antagonism, and it escalated because it was three in the summer, it was continuing. They got to the point where they felt the police weren't doing enough
to protect them.
Yep. The fights went on, and in the end it exploded into these riots. And by that time the police were involved because they'd just become so frustrated and they were throwing petrol bombs at the police. So there was these kind of really heavy scenes of fires and damage. And what was difficult for people to understand was that these people, unlike other riots in the past where it may have been immigrants who'd come over, these guys were born in the UK. And so that's what's quite different. 9/11 was a few weeks later, and so we didn't know it at the time, but it was kind of the framing of a problematic Muslim community.
Already because of the riots?
Yeah.
So what were they saying in the media and in politics?
At the time, the riots, the media was quite hysterical. What was interesting was the parliamentary discourse at the time, which is what they were reporting on. And some things they were saying was that even at that time, very early on, they were saying that we should think about citizenship requirements, and so that was one of the ways of bringing people fragmented back together again. And so English language requirements would be one of those things that brings everyone together. Just in terms of the images at the time, in terms of newspapers, there was a lot of Asian. If you imagine the figure of an Asian youth against the police, against that kind of institution, and that's where it started. And in the paper, then I trace this kind of violence language.
Your academic paper?
Yeah, sorry, yeah. The discourse of violence linked to, segregation. Where those people were segregated. That's why, they.
So how did you exactly analyze this?
What I did was I started going backwards. I was quite shocked in 2011
because you're British Asian yourself.
No. Well, I mean, I obviously I see some of the things going on. What I was shocked about in 2011 was David Kamran gave a speech in Munich.
So we had 2001 and now 2011, 10 years later.
2011, yeah. So this is when I'm doing my PhD now. So I'm into it now, and I'm keeping a track because I'm doing citizenship and I'm watching all the political discourse. The thing David Kamran said at the time was that he talked about terrorism, and in this speech he's talking to all the leaders. Terrorism. And he's talking about NATO, all Afghanistan, all these problems, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of all of this, he talks about integration, and then he talks about, and we need to make sure that immigrants speak English, and straight away that didn't make sense to me. And
why not?
because I just don't see the link between people, speaking English well and terrorism, especially if some of the terrorists, for example, people in the London bombings, they were born in England, they spoke English perfectly. So
2005.
Yeah, 2005. Even if you go back to Charlie Hebdo, if you look at one of the first things the receptionist says when people enter the Charlie Hebdo headquarters, she says they spoke perfect French. So even speaking that perfect language was no defense. It didn't stop any. It's no guarantee. Is what I was going to say. So I was shocked by that kind of discourse, and
so you had been analysing the discourse in the media and politics.
That's why I went backwards. I couldn't understand why security. I still don't. I mean, it doesn't really make sense why those things are linked. I went back. I looked at the security studies as a subject area, and they've had a growing literature on securitization, which is the process of making a fairly ordinary issue a security issue, basically.
Can you give an example, such as learning English and terrorism?
So the 2015 Theresa May gives a speech that we need to be doing more to confront radical Islam, extremist ideologies. And her logic was that, and you can see it in the speech as well, that people live in isolated communities, and they live in isolated communities because they can't speak English, and that's the kind of logic that's been put forward.
So have you seen this elsewhere in Europe as well, or have you only focused on the British context?
In that paper, it's only on the British context, and that's one of the things I want to do next, is start looking at the context, and part of that is because I need to get translations of some of the discourse, but. I know in Holland, for example, it's often Holland's usually the first place where a lot of this kind of discourse starts. They were the first ones with citizenship, one of the early ones with citizenship, and the British followed afterwards. And the integration discourses, especially after Theo Van Gogh.
Van Gogh, yes.
We tend to follow what they do and things like that. So, yeah, we need more context on that.
So what is the main conclusion of your paper?
The main conclusion of the paper is that security and language are being framed in ways that we haven't seen really before in the way that they are now. And we need to, and as people in social linguistics, we need to look into this and see what's happening, because security is a big part of our society, again, in a way that hasn't been before. Even Edward Snowden, even some of the surveillance measures, Patriot Act in the US, all these things are examples of security entering everyday lives. And now we're seeing it, and we're seeing it in the discourse, but when they're starting to produce tests based on some of this discourse, then it's going to have a severe,
You mean language tests part of an integration process?
Yeah, and it has. Now, one of the things with every test. So Samuel Messick is a validity expert. Really like
within language testing.
Yeah, a very forward-thinking guy. And one of the things he said, even in the 90s, I believe, late 80s, was the way in which tests have social values, and they embody certain values and ideologies. And so a lot of people think tests are really objective and scientific, but we know in these cases when they're used for immigration control, basically they're actually talking about exclusion, and it's delaying the amount of time someone can actually make a life for themselves in the country. So those are some of the things that we need to start thinking about.
What do you like most about doing research?
What do I like most? I like learning. I like going back. I like looking at what's going on, and I like looking at older philosophical works and seeing the way these things connect, because quite often we can see some of the things even years ago, things that people are talking about. So I find that really fascinating.